Tonight, I'm hoping we will switch our minds a little bit so that we can kind of get even more practical. And we're going to do a bit of hard work tonight because we're going to go through quite a bit of content. So you don't have to necessarily have your running shoes on. I'm not going to make you run around the building. But I'm hoping that mentally we are ready to add a little bit of flesh to what we've gone through so far. If I'm going too quickly, if I'm pushing too much into this, so please promise me that you'll wave at me and just tell me to stop or to pause or to clarify or anything like that if I'm overwhelming you too much. I wanted to start this evening with just revising what we were saying on the very first night. Do you remember this incredible object lesson that we spoke about that God has built into the body? I was blessed when I first became aware of this, or when this first came to mind, that we have this body that hinges on blood circulation. It is the absolute essence of the health of every single cell. And the blood is so crucial. It is life-giving, it is life-supporting to every cell, but it is channeled through these little pipes that don't make any blood in and of themselves, just like the Bible says that we cannot produce any goodness of ourselves, but we can channel the goodness of the Lord to people around us. I've been blessed by that. And I'm reminding us of that because there's something else that links with us that I'm hoping tonight we can add to what we've already discussed. And that is the fact that, and I promise this is not going to become a whole sermon, but have you ever noticed this verse in Mark where it talks about when Jesus was speaking to his disciples, and it talks about him appointing the 12. And one of the things that he said to them is he wanted to instruct them to go out and share the good news that they've learned. So he sent them out to preach, but it doesn't stop there. It also says that he gave them the power to heal sicknesses. Do you think that the information that you're learning here tonight and in the other nights that we've had so far, do you think that that information is information that you might be able to share with other people that can help them in some way?
Yes.
That is, for me, an extra bonus to what we're learning, because we're not only learning about how we can help ourselves, how we can assist our own bodies in healing. We're not only learning how we can feel better and get, relief from the suffering of our diseases, but it goes beyond that. I believe that every single time that we can learn from the way that God has created the body, we're also able to gain information of how we can bless somebody else in the process. And I think that is part of what Jesus had in mind for the disciples, to be able to share with people that God is a practical God. He's not just theoretical about what you learn about praying and, just your belief system, but the rest of your life is separate. Our faith in God embeds and encompasses every aspect of our lives, including our practical ways of living. So with that in mind, I'm hoping that what we go through tonight will again empower you to have better health yourself, but give you one more tool that you can share again with other people to take this information a little bit further. Now, just for interest sake, how many of us have washing machines in our homes? Most of us. I hope that you feel blessed and that you count yourself blessed. When I was visiting some other areas, I will not necessarily mention all of them, but I have visited communities where in a hall of over 300 people, less than 20% of them had ever used a washing machine before. So we are blessed with what we have. Is a washing machine a convenient thing to have? Pretty convenient. Why do we find it helpful? What does it do for us? Saves quite a lot of time, right? All right. That was just an interesting thought. Random thing. Anyways, okay, so we're talking about something else tonight. We're not talking about our conveniences necessarily, but we're going to discuss Healthy Harry a little bit further. And we have spoken about Healthy Harry's circulatory system and his blood circulation. We have spoken about Healthy Harry's bones and what we can learn from the condition of his bones and his joints. You all remember something about that at least? What did we speak about last night? His liver, okay? We spoke about his liver and the fact that his liver has, if I have to refresh your memories quickly, yes? Basically two main categories of work, absolutely. A whole bunch of jobs for the daytime, which is part of digestion or supporting digestion, and at nighttime, what does it do? Switches over to cleaning up, absolutely, and repair goes hand in hand with that, right? Okay, now with that in mind, we're going on to a new system, so we're looking at the digestive system. And as I said yesterday, the digestive system works hand in hand with the liver, so we keep that in the back of our minds as well. Now, Healthy Harry might not always be aware of exactly how things happen, because obviously he can't see his digestive tract the way that we can see it right now. But every time that he's eating something, his whole system is activated to start working. Every single time he puts anything into his mouth, there is a machine that starts working. There are chemical processes that start up. There are metabolic processes that start happening, and there's a whole spin-off effect from that. There's a whole bunch of processes that happen each and every time he eats anything. To orientate ourselves, we just quickly want to kind of revise and make sure that we know what the track is, or what the pathway is that food will follow as it goes through. And this might be common knowledge to many of you. Is this something that is new to anybody, or is this very, very common knowledge? We don't always learn much about this process, right? So we put food in our mouth, and where does digestion start happening? Way low down, or does it start in the mouth? It actually starts in the mouth. You're all in agreement. I'm glad you already know this. That's good. So digestion begins in the mouth, and it is a twofold process. There's mechanical digestion in the mouth in the form of chewing, and there's chemical digestion that also starts in the mouth. Now, before I go any further, an interesting thing that I learned probably about 5 years ago, but never learned in medical school, was that you actually have sensors in your mouth that analyze exactly what you're eating. It analyzes how many of these proteins and those proteins and this carbohydrate and that. And that analysis process then has a connection where, through the neurological system, through the hormonal system, it communicates to the stomach, so that by the time that you swallow that food, your stomach is already preparing exactly the right stuff to digest that particular meal. Isn't that incredible? All right, fearfully and wonderfully made. We have the throat and the mouth, then we swallow, and that esophagus basically just takes the food down. And then the food goes into the stomach, and where it lands in the stomach, that is where a lot of the digestion action will happen. Once it has finished digesting in the stomach, digestion completes essentially there, and then only that mixture will pass through and it'll go into the small intestine. And the small intestine is a very, very long pipe. I can't actually remember the distance. I wanted to check it again this afternoon because I've forgotten it. But it's long. It's a couple of meters long, and the small intestine is made in such a long pipe to increase the surface area so that that food mixture can basically come into contact directly next to the blood circulation system, so that all of those nutrients can be transferred from the food mixture into the blood circulation. So the longer the pipe, the more contact time it provides between the intestine and the blood circulation, and it provides opportunity for all of those nutrients to actually get taken up into the bloodstream. So that is where absorption takes place primarily. There's a bit of absorption in the mouth, there's a little bit in the stomach, there's a bit even in the large intestine, but the majority of absorption takes place in this mixture in the middle here, or those small intestines that are basically bundled up together right in the center. And then after the food has gone through that whole long process, it enters the large intestine at the bottom part here, goes up, across and down, and that is the last pathway out. The primary function of the large intestine, or the colon, is to take out the extra moisture. So to absorb all of that extra moisture into the bloodstream so that we conserve that moisture, and then it forms the stool that is passed out. That is the basic pathway that food follows. Are we all together at this stage? Anybody confused where we are right now? Okay. This will start to make a little bit more sense as we keep going, but that's just a little bit of a closer picture. And you can see on this picture that the liver and the pancreas are also showing here, and it automatically comes up in diagrams when we ask for diagrams of the digestive tract. Now, as you can see here, the food doesn't go through the liver. It goes through the piping system, which is this whole process of here and down and out. But the liver is connected to the system through the bile duct. The liver has all its day job, night job functions, but it, amongst other things, produces bile. It is stored in the bile duct, and that connects, and bile is released through a little duct as a little side injection, basically, into the intestines. And it aids the process of particularly fat absorption. Do you know what bile consists of? Lots of different things. We're not going to get too technical, but bile to some extent is almost like adding dishwashing liquid to the water. If you are trying to wash fatty things in water without any soap, does it come clean or does it stay fatty? It stays fatty. Your soap changes the surface tension and that allows for the fat to get dissolved. That's basically one of the main functions of bile. But some toxins are also basically excreted through the bile to get rid of it out of the body. So it is both a way or a mechanism to get rid of toxins as well as a way for changing the fats in a way that they can be absorbed. Alright. Then the pancreas also sits here because it also has a bunch of extra jobs, and we're not going to dig deep, but the pancreas is quite complicated as well, and we're not going to focus too much on that. We are going to look at more of its metabolic functions a little bit. Not confused yet, you're still with me? Okay. Now I want to show you this picture. This is a diagram that is illustrating what the stomach looks like, and they've drawn it in such a way that basically some of the layers are opened up little by little so that you can see the different layers that form the wall of the stomach. How many of us think about the stomach as just a little baggie that keeps the food in there? That's what I had in my mind most of my life until I got into the anatomy books. And then you see this and you realize, okay, but it's quite a bit more complicated than that. And what is fascinating about this is that the majority of the layers that are part of the wall of the stomach are muscle layers. Why would it need muscle layers? Exactly, that is what it's using to contract and expand. So you've got a bunch of muscle layers here, they perform contractions there. You will see that there's a little band across the top there that forms the top valve at the top of the stomach. What is not drawn on here or on any of the other pictures is that the diaphragm basically sits across like that. Now, you know about the diaphragm. Most of us have heard about the diaphragm. We hear about the diaphragm when you're in choir or in singing class because they talk about taking deep breaths and using your diaphragm. Basically, the diaphragm sits like a big parachute, like a big dome across, and it's got a hole in the middle for that esophagus pipe. So the esophagus pipe comes from the top, goes through that opening in the diaphragm, and then the stomach sits just below the diaphragm. So the diaphragm forms a separation between the lungs and the abdominal cavity. The diaphragm forms part of what closes off the top of the stomach. Now, why is that necessary? Because you can imagine if your stomach is full of food, if it's squeezing together like a nice long, strong contraction with those muscles, where is all of that content going to go? It's going to go upwards, right? So it has to close off, and the diaphragm is part of that, and there are other muscles there that help to close off the top. What we also need to notice is that there is a bit, and this is not drawn all that clearly, but there's a circular muscle around the bottom part that closes off the bottom of the stomach. Why would it need to do that? If yes. There we go.
So when you're digesting, the food doesn't go through that pipe.
Exactly, it forms a container essentially, right? So if you have this open all the time, then everything that you eat will just kind of go all the way through and it won't actually have the time for digestion. Now, what exactly is the digestion action that we're talking about? What has to happen to the food? Do we have large pieces of carrot floating around in our veins and our arteries?
No. The food, what it does is that it breaks down the food into small pieces, and the small pieces get thrown into the stomach, which then get broken down into small molecules.
Absolutely. So you've got some of that breakdown that'll happen in the mouth. Your teeth are going to do a big part of that. That's a lot of the mechanical work. But then the stomach will continue the mechanical and the chemical work to break it down even more so that the food is really, really smooth. It basically makes a smoothie in the stomach. Think of it like a smoothie maker if you want to. And that smoothie allows for that mixture once it gets to the intestines so that things can actually get absorbed from that. Because if you've got big chunks of food in the intestines, there's no absorption that takes place out of that. Your body literally cannot extract the nutrients from there. So you've got a dual action happening here with the mechanical and the chemical digestion. Was there a hand up? Did I miss one? Just wave at me or shout at me if there's any questions. Okay. Now, before we go on, one more interesting thing about that valve at the bottom. That valve at the bottom of the stomach actually opens periodically, even while the stomach is busy digesting a meal. And it allows tiny little samples of that liquid to go through, and then just directly past this valve, in this early part of the duodenum, you have small little receptors, again, that analyze and check whether the food is broken down to a molecular level or whether it's still too big and chunky. And if the food is still too big, the particles are still too big, then there's again feedback to that valve to say, stay closed, keep the jug closed, we still need to do more digesting. If the food is liquid enough, then it opens up and it allows that mixture to pass through. Isn't that amazing? Now keep that in mind, because that will be a very important aspect to understand what we are going to add to this, because it helps us to understand how we can either support this process to happen properly, or we can mess it up significantly. I want us to go back to the washing machine, because the reality is what we've just spoken about is a machine that uses chemical and mechanical processes, and that is exactly what a washing machine does, is it not? Your washing machine mechanically tumbles everything around to create friction, and it has the chemical aspect with water and the soap. And that is how it enables those particles, those little particles of dirt and grime to come free or to be removed from your clothing. That is essentially what we've just said, is that the stomach uses a mechanical process and a chemical process. Now that chemical process, we're not going to dive very deeply into that, but is it just one random mixture of acid that's in there? That's what I thought all the way through my life, because in high school you learn about hydrochloric acid, and that's all they do essentially here. Okay, I didn't do biology at school because I didn't know that I was going to go into medicine, but you learn about hydrochloric acid and you kind of think that it's just a very acidic environment and it just dissolves everything. It just kind of zaps it because it's such a strong acid. But like we said, the mouth analyzes, it communicates through to the stomach, and there are specific acids and enzymes specific to different food components that will be secreted by the stomach. So this is not just any washing machine, this is a smart washing machine, like top of the range, honestly. And because it is such a smart washing machine, we have to acknowledge that it does a couple of things. Number one, it doesn't have a generic process, it is specific to every meal. And it also does it systematically. Things are broken down in a specific order in order not to create chemical disasters. Do chemicals interact with each other? They absolutely do. And even if we didn't do chemistry for very long, we know that chemical reactions take place. So the stomach actually digests things in a particular order, which means that once it starts the process of digesting a particular meal, the ideal is to actually allow for it, just the same as a washing machine, to start the cycle and finish the cycle. If you are busy doing a load of washing, does that machine do the same thing for the whole hour that it's busy? What does it do?
It starts and stops it.
It starts, it does the water where the soap washes in, then it tumbles that, then it does a rinse and a spin and a rinse and a... Okay. So if that machine is, basically, it's got 3 minutes left, it's busy doing, let's say it's got 7 minutes left, it's doing the last rinse, and it's going to do the last spin, and the children come with a really muddy jersey and they add it into the machine, right at the end, is mom going to just sit back and go, yes, mommy, add it in, no problem. What's mom going to do? She's going to have a mini heart attack and say, please, can you not do that? And hopefully interrupt before the muddy jersey goes into the machine. And that's why we love the front loaders that the door actually locks, right? You can't add it in. If you can prevent it, that's even better. Because the ideal, in fact not the ideal, it is crucial for that machine to start and finish its whole process, go through its whole cycle, in order to get the washing clean and have the end result that we want. Is that right? Do we do the same for the stomach though? Don't you think we treat the stomach a bit like a top loader?
Yeah.
You know, you add the washing, and then it's already busy for about 10 minutes, then you walk through the passage and you realize you dropped the socks on the way to the washing machine, and you just go and add those in. Don't we do the same with the stomach? What happens to the washing machine if you keep adding dirty washing through the whole cycle? You end up with a product that is not the same as what you were hoping for. Now, how many people in society struggle with gastrointestinal problems? How common is it for people to struggle with bloating, pains that don't clear up? They go for tests, they go for scans, nobody knows what's happening, and eventually they say, oh, you've got IBS. Is that common? It's extremely common, extremely common. Am I saying that IBS doesn't exist? No. What I'm saying is that there are many symptoms that are directly related to whether or not we allow for the stomach to actually do its process properly. Now let's just think about that practically very quickly. If I'm eating a meal and my stomach has already started digesting that meal, maybe I've had an early breakfast, 2.5 hours later it has done a lot of the mechanical processes. Those muscles have been contracting. They squash and they squeeze and they squash and they squeeze. On the picture of the stomach that we had before, you see that there's a lot of these little folds in the inner lining of the stomach. That is again to increase the surface area. It allows it to stretch and gives it the space to stretch, but it also increases the friction and it uses all of these different mechanisms to break that food down. So 2 hours into the process, it's done a lot of work, the muscles have been contracting, it's added all the chemicals in there, it's been breaking things down in a specific order, and then I eat a couple of cherry tomatoes and some cucumbers because I know that they are healthy. And what exactly happens at that point? In which ways? You're absolutely right, but how? Do you remember that little valve over there and the receptors that check? So now there's big chunks of food in there again, right? So now those need to be helped. So there's a bit of a restart to the process because this machine detects that there's new stuff that needs to be digested. There's a whole bunch of mechanisms through which it can actually detect that there's new things that are there. And then the small little samples going through are detecting that there's undigested big particles of food again. So what is the instruction given to this valve? To stay closed for longer, right? So that mixture stays. But then 2.5 hours after that, I'm eating my lunch. And breakfast hasn't emptied out yet because it was still restarting the cycle a little bit. So now I've added lunch into that mixture. What happens now? It's kind of trying to restart. It's got big chunks. It's got mixture of very well digested food and very undigested food. And the stomach muscles will be contracting and contracting and contracting. How long can those muscles contract before they can't contract anymore? Can they squash and squeeze indefinitely? Would you agree with me that we actually think that they can? We sort of grew up thinking that the stomach just does its thing all day long, right? The stomach muscles, those layers, can actually do effective contractions for a maximum of 5 hours. After 5 hours, it starts kind of just doing, you know, when you've walked a significant distance, like in school when they forced you to run long distance and you didn't like it, eventually the muscles feel like they're just wobbly a little bit, right? That's basically what starts happening. Those muscles aren't contracting anymore. So now you've got breakfast that has been in that stomach too long. You've got the snack, mid-morning snack that is partially digested. You've just added lunch, which is undigested. The stomach muscles aren't contracting anymore. That valve is trying to stay closed, but the stomach is now stretched to double volume because it's still... Are we seeing that there's a potential problem here? Now, 7 hours after having had my breakfast, if that breakfast is still trapped in this compartment and it hasn't moved through yet, at 40 degrees Celsius more or less, what is starting to happen to breakfast? It starts to ferment, it starts to rot, it is starting to smell interesting, and by the time that the valve eventually opens for one of two reasons, either because the food has finally digested after way too many hours, or because the stomach is just distended to the point that it's going to burst and it allows the content through, what is going through to the intestines for absorption? A mixture of two things. Breakfast, which has started fermenting already, and lunch, which is not completely digested. So what am I going to be absorbing into the bloodstream? Toxins, and not enough nutrients because there aren't nutrients available to absorb to the maximum. And some of those great nutrients have already started actually becoming rotten, right? So do we see that this is actually a way bigger issue than what we realize? This basic concept of the routine of our meals has an impact on both the nutritional status of our blood, whether or not we have deficiencies, and the toxin content. Do we see that? Do we see how easily this can actually lead to nutritional deficiencies? Do we see how easily this can lead to overloading the toxic system and the rubbish bin and filling it up too quickly? Yes?
What's
So that is the good question. Those muscles effectively contract approximately 5 hours, right?
5 hours.
So after 5 hours, the ideal is that the stomach has emptied and that there's actually a rest period. That would be the absolute ideal. If I've had my meal, it has been contracting, the chemical and mechanical processes have been happening, it's finished its cycle, and it's actually, the valve was opened up and that content is emptied out, and the stomach has had a short rest period, then it's ready to digest the next meal pretty well again. But if it hasn't had the rest, and if there's overlap between the meals, if I'm eating a meal before the previous meal has emptied out, it's literally like trying to add the next load of washing into the machine before taking the previous lot out. It really doesn't work. So in essence, this is the summary, and yes, your washing machine probably does a cycle for a little bit quicker. It thankfully doesn't take 5 hours to do a load of washing, but our stomachs do take approximately 5 hours to do a load of washing. So we are hoping that by the end of this, we can learn that that is the time that actually is required. Now let me ask you this. If I've only had a smoothie for breakfast, for argument's sake, I've had a small glass of smoothie which is already mechanically somewhat digested, is that going to require a full 5 hours? It's not. So one option, and this is what is generally taught, is that I can have a small meal and have another small meal and have another small meal and another small meal, because the idea is that that small meal will finish digesting after about 2.5 to 3 hours. But if I do that, if I eat every 3 hours, am I allowing the rest period? I'm not. So I'm working on the idea that that food might theoretically be finished digesting very quickly. But if I'm keeping the stomach in motion repeatedly without breaks, eventually, later on in the day, I'm not going to have effective digestion, right? And then when do I typically eat my main meal, if I follow the general custom of the day? In the evenings. How ready is that stomach to digest at its optimal capacity in the evening? Especially if I've been snacking little bits during the day. Those muscles can't do that. So do we see that both in the routine of the day, the meal content, and the general way that we end up eating, we can very easily cause this process to become a nightmare? Yes?
But that also all depends on what you're eating. If you're eating a piece of steak, for example, it will take longer to digest than like an avo, for example.
Okay, so we have to keep that in mind. Your 5-hour period that stomach muscle can effectively digest, it is going to do that, and it will be able to finish digesting that meal and empty out if that meal content is correct. Now, you touched on a very important point, and that is very true, that there are some things that cannot actually digest within 5 hours, meat being one of them. So meat can stay in the stomach, and it can require between 6 and 8 hours of digesting. Cheese can take up to 12 hours to digest. We have done gastroscopies for patients. You're all familiar with gastroscopy, where you put the camera, they always say that you swallow the camera or the test. I have assisted doctors where they are doing those gastroscopies, where the person's last meal was the night before, maybe 6 or 7 in the evening the night before. Then we do the gastroscopy tomorrow morning at 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock, and we are still seeing yesterday's food in the stomach, and I promise you, you can smell how foul and rotten that has become. Does that clarify why we don't feel very great? Yes?
Doesn't that also interfere with the liver's functioning of cleaning out
Okay.
that amount?
So if I am producing toxins in my stomach with all this fermenting food all the time, is that contributing to the liver's workload of clearing out toxins? It's majorly contributing. And the whole process of bile being secreted and all of that, it's meant to happen periodically. It's not meant to happen repeatedly over and over and over throughout the day. So I'm requiring those organs to do something that they weren't made to do. They weren't created to be able to sustain that kind of demand, and that means that they end up malfunctioning. Okay? So we have spoken about the content of the stomach and how that affects things. If I have food that is, if I eat for supper in the first place, and I have put that supper meal into a stomach that is already exhausted from the whole day of work, is that supper going to digest very effectively? No. And then if I eat my steak at night time, how well is that going to digest? So then that food is sitting in the stomach, and this we should also add, that effective mechanical process of the stomach is very effective, provided that the stomach is rested. So in the early morning, If I've had an empty stomach for the night time, that stomach is ready. But if I've had food rotting all night in the gastrointestinal tract, is that stomach even ready for breakfast? Even though I've theoretically not eaten for a couple of hours, it's not really ready for breakfast even. Have you heard of people saying, oh, I don't feel well in the morning, I can't have breakfast because I don't feel like I can eat in the mornings? Is it possible that that could be because they are having late suppers, that are not digesting properly? It certainly is a big contributor. You have a question there?
Do liquids activate the digestive system, or is it a different type of?
Is it a different type of thing that happens, or process that happens?
Very good question. What do the liquids do to this process? Have you noticed that your washing machine is set to be able to add a specific amount? It somehow measures, I don't know exactly how all of that works in a washing machine, but it measures how much water it allows in per washing load, right? Your stomach uses both let me put it this way, liquid is the digestive acid, or it's the medium through which digestive acids and enzymes are released into the stomach, but it has an inherent mechanism through which it keeps those acids and enzymes at maximum concentration. So it will try and release it with a maximum amount of enzyme level and acid level with minimal liquid, so that it can allow, the acid to have the strongest chemical effect. In addition to that, if you try and imagine in your mind, if you've got a little Ziploc bag, if you put a piece of bread, small little piece of bread into that little bag, and it's an empty Ziploc bag with just the bread, if you squash against it on the outside, you're going to break it down quite easily, right? What happens if you fill that bag up with water and you've got a little piece of bread floating around in the water, and then you squash the bag on the outside? Are you breaking down the bread easily? The liquid it prevents the friction from happening. So if we are having liquids, you are very right that liquids are important. If I'm dehydrated, my body is not able to produce the acids and the enzymes correctly. But if I add a lot of liquids together with a meal, I'm actually preventing the digestion, because I'm reducing the friction action and I'm diluting the acids so they are not at maximum strength. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And then, sorry, just on top of that, is hunger an indication of I should eat now, or is hunger an indication of I didn't get enough nutrition in my last meal because I might have eaten junk food? How do we gauge that?
That is an excellent question. And I'm very glad that you're asking this now, because I usually forget to actually add this here. I'm always worried that I'm bombing people with too much and then I run ahead, but I think that is very, very crucial. What is hunger and where is that sensation going to come from? Let me ask you this first. Where do you actually experience the sensation of hunger?
1 second. Right.
There is this gland they call hypothalamus,
Yes?
which is somewhere. It's the one that reports that the stomach needs food.
Okay.
It's not in the stomach.
It's not in the stomach. So I'm experiencing hunger with parts of my brain, and yes, the hypothalamus plays a role. There are various compartments in the brain that actually have an impact on how I interpret my hunger and how I experience that. But hunger is what I am thinking about in my mind. It is very much possible for that mind or for that brain signal to actually get confused. And what is one of the top reasons for us to feel hunger? Thirst. Dehydration is the biggest, by far, the biggest reason for us to feel a sense of hunger. Why exactly that is the case, I don't know, but I think it's because we probably have trained ourselves to just put something in our mouths every time we think about our stomachs. But thirst is a very high, my brain is going blank, I think I'm dehydrated. Thirst is a very big cause, or a very common cause for us to experience hunger sensations. Another extremely common reason for us to feel hunger, even when I don't need extra nutrition at that stage, is actually, believe it or not, when the stomach is overworked and crying out for help, if you like. There are some authors that actually describe it like that, but when the stomach has been overworked and it is exhausted and it's not working properly, especially when there's already inflammation, what happens to rotten food? What exactly happens during the process of fermentation? What does it produce? And, yes?
Alcohol.
And alcohol, exactly. So, do you remember what we said yesterday, or was it yesterday or the day before? We spoke about the fact that alcohol is a toxin, we'd gladly stay away from it if we can. but we can produce alcohol in the stomach. Did you know that you can actually have a brewery in your stomach? Not a great idea, but alcohol is it's a very strong chemical, is it not? So the inner lining of the stomach gets damaged by that, it gets inflamed by that, and that can again trigger the sensation of hunger because it triggers neurological sensations, it stimulates the nerves around the stomach, and it can give you a false sense of hunger. Something that we have actually counseled parents about oftentimes is that young children can be very peckish. Have you noticed that small little kids, especially toddlers, can go, Mommy, I want this, Mommy, I want that, Mommy, can I have, Mommy, can I have? In the majority of cases, it is an overworked, uncomfortable stomach, and they have no way whatsoever to interpret it as, I'm actually not hungry, my stomach is actually uncomfortable. So they just have the sensation, and then they kind of tend to self-soothe to some extent by putting more into the stomach, which aggravates the process. So oftentimes when we can help children already from a very young age to get into a set routine of having regular meals, it relieves that, it makes them less agitated, and it has an impact on their memory, it's got an impact on the brain, etc. If I'm producing toxic chemicals inside my stomach all the time, how is that going to affect other organs? We've mentioned that it overloads the liver and it adds toxicity. Is it going to have an impact on my brain and my mental clarity? Very much so. And I wish that I knew about this when I was a student, because I think I would have made my life easier if I was studying with a clear mind and not actually making things worse by snacking and interrupting this process all day long, and I really was very good at that. Okay, so we have looked at the mechanism of action of the stomach, and I have made available in this presentation for us to look a little bit more at the metabolism. Are you still feeling okay? Can we add a little bit more flesh? Remember, I told you I'm wearing my tracksuit pants, so I'm ready, but you must tell me if you need to stop, okay? So if you've got this discomfort aspect, those are alarm bells, but we want to see what else contributes to this process. And how we deal with the stomach definitely has a big part to play with that. So if Healthy Harry has experienced some discomfort, there might be a couple of things that he's not aware of. So one possibility is that he's not actually aware that he should be treating his stomach like a front loader that has a door that locks, instead of treating his stomach like a top loader that can just be added in. We started, when we learned about this, initially we actually started teaching Abigail, my daughter, and we said to her, when we were finished eating a meal, when we got up from the table and we started clearing the table, we said to her, okay, remember, your washing machine is starting now, we're going to press the start button, now we're going to leave it. And when she asked for some food and things, an hour, 2 hours later, I would just say to her, are you sure your washing machine is done yet? And she would stand there, she would go, no, I think it's still busy actually. I'm like, okay, so let's drink some water. And it made an incredible impact on her to recognize that we don't have to put something in the mouth just every time we think about food. But what we also taught her is that relying on what she feels like is not the gauge. Because instead of relying on, oh, do I feel hungry? Do I feel like the washing machine is empty or not? How many of us can feel when that stomach empties out and when the food moves across? We actually can't feel it. So it's much safer to work on the 5-hour gauge and to know, I've started a machine that works on a 5-hour cycle. I need to give it its 5 hours. And then we actually showed her on the clock, we gave her ways and mechanisms to just work it out. And she very quickly learned to go, oh, we finished breakfast at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1. Oh, my machine is still busy, let me drink. I'm not ready to eat yet. And it was incredible to see how, for her, to just consciously be able to say, my machine is still busy, settled the hunger question so that she actually realized, I'm not actually hungry. And we don't actually do that, right? We typically speaking just go, oh, I feel like something. And we don't even think about whether the stomach really needs something. More importantly, we started teaching her that at that point where she says to us, she's really hungry, what does that tell us? Where is the food? It's moved through down to the intestine, right? At the point where she's actually honestly saying, Mommy, I'm really starving, I'm really hungry, then I know the stomach is empty. And that is the ideal time to say, okay, let's just give that stomach a little half an hour, come and help me, let's finish the final preparation for the meal, and drink water while we're doing the food prep, because it's just having its rest, right? Can it rest while it's still busy digesting the last meal? It can't. So when it's digesting, give it that time, give it the 5 hours, and once you get to the point where you can feel, are you hungry, it means that it is empty probably, And that is the stage where you can then say, let me have my last bit of hydration. I'm not going to drink my liquids with my meal, so let me drink a bit before. Give it time, do your final prep, and then you're ready to have the meal. That gives you the assurance that you're putting that meal into a stomach that is empty and ready to digest it. Does that sound better? Absolutely, yes.
So I think what Barbara Nell says is you shouldn't be drinking half an hour before you eat and an hour after you eat. Is that the parameters?
Yes, that's a good gauge, and it comes back to what you were asking about what the stomach does with liquids. Liquids can be absorbed directly from the stomach lining straight into the bloodstream, water especially. So if I'm having a lot of liquids with food, my whole stomach basically gears towards getting rid of that liquid first, which is what delays the process. But if I'm drinking on an empty stomach, it means it just absorbs, it doesn't activate the digestive processes if it's just liquids. If I am eating my meal, once that meal has been digesting for about an hour, the majority of the chemical processes has already taken place, which is why it is then okay to start drinking more liquids again, because then the strong acid effect is already, has already kicked in, basically. Yeah.
So does the same apply to somebody who's an athlete, for example? Does that speed up the process in terms of the digestive process? For example,
If you're running the comrades, for example, training to do that, are you still following the same things? Does it not speed up the recovery process or the digestive process?
That's a good question, and I know that the athletes kind of work out their meals and their drinking and everything according to a lot of very technical aspects. To be honest with you, I feel like running the comrades is probably not a good thing in the first place. I personally just think it's a strain on the body that we weren't designed for it to take. But that is my personal opinion, and maybe it's a little bit biased because I really don't like running in the first place. But that being said, for the guys who are really fit, their exercise is a good thing. Unfortunately, I think a lot of athletes assume that because they're very active, that the stomach can digest a full meal in much shorter time, and that isn't actually the case. So athletes would generally also do better by spacing meals further apart and respecting the 5-hour cycle, because the other thing that happens, which we sometimes forget about, is that when I'm eating a meal, if within the first hour or two after eating that meal I'm engaging in really intensive exercise, I'm diverting my resources. A lot of blood supply goes to the muscles then, and it can actually slow down the digestive process. So you get maximum muscle availability and energy availability at which point? Do you get the maximum energy when the food is still in the stomach or when it's absorbed? Once it's absorbed, if you can allow the digestive process to have taken place, then those nutrients are absorbed and actually available to the cells. But a lot of athletes and a lot of guys going to the gym, many people think, they have to have something to eat a half an hour before they go to the gym because they need to make sure that they have, some energy for the gymming. What you eat a half an hour before the gym doesn't allow for that energy to be immediately available. It still has to first go through digestion. So does that answer your question? All right. So Healthy Harry, you've got a question. Sorry.
I just want to add to that. The research has shown that between half an hour to 3 hours after you started with intense exercise like the comrades, your whole digestive system shuts down. So it doesn't help you eating before you're going for strenuous exercise because it doesn't add anything.
And you know what would make more sense if people are going to do intensive exercises is obviously to have good nutrition at a time where the stomach can digest, but probably during something like a race, for them to actually take nutrition in a liquid form that can be absorbed a little bit better. But that certainly doesn't mean that liquid nutrition is always the best. It might be the kind of emergency measure for that scenario, but our bodies definitely do better with whole foods, not the liquid processed foods. All right, so this concept, as basic as it is, I'm sure that you're able to see from what we've discussed, has an impact on the whole process. It's got an impact on toxin levels, on nutrition actually being available to absorb, the whole lot of it. So it would be good for Healthy Harry to actually learn about this and know about it. It would also be good for him to attend the liver lecture so that he can recognize that his meal that he has late at night actually now has double problems. Last night we recognized that the late evening meal keeps the liver out of detox mode, but it also keeps the digestive tract in action mode for far too long, and digestion doesn't completely take place properly during sleep, which means there's a lot of food or a lot of extra rotting and fermentation that happens if I'm eating late at night. Do you see how the two link together and they're harmonized? both the liver and the stomach work far better if I'm not going to eat and have a meal in the stomach by the time I sleep. Does that mean that we can never eat something in the evenings? No, like we said also for the liver, if I'm having a light meal in the evenings and I'm having it far enough time away from sleep time, that's fine. But now do you see how it actually depends also to some extent on what the day has been like? Because if I've been snacking all day long and I'm having my light meal, but I'm adding it to undigested food that hasn't emptied the stomach, that's going to cause a problem. So the only time where that evening meal is actually really safe is not only when it's light and at the right time, but also making sure that lunch was far enough apart. Does that make sense? If I had lunch at 3 and I'm having my light evening meal at 5, that's not going to be the right thing. So spacing the meals so that each meal has at least 5 hours to digest, ideally a little bit of a rest gap between, and then making sure that the evening is not the heaviest meal of the day. All of those things come together. All right. We have already mentioned this, and of course stretching those day hours and making sure that we are working into the evening hours definitely doesn't help any of this work any better. Now, this is a busy slide, and we're not going to focus on all of this because we are jam-packing a lot into this. But I wanted to spend a quick few moments speaking about insulin and why insulin can cause such a lot of problems. Insulin is a good thing. It's a necessary thing. It's absolutely crucial for our bodies in terms of how it utilizes what we've eaten. Now, we're actually tracking down the digestive tract. We've had food that comes through the mouth, into the stomach. We've spoken about how it digests in the stomach. It's now gone into the intestines. We're not going to talk too much detail, but from there, the nutrients are taken into the bloodstream, right? But now it's in the blood. So now I've got the carbohydrates and all my nutrients. They're actually in the blood. And we're just wanting to focus on what the body does with the energy that I've eaten and how that affects this whole process. Insulin, if you were to summarize it over here, there's a couple of different things that it does, but basically one of the primary focus areas for insulin is making sure that the blood is not over-concentrated with sugar. What did we say about sugar? Is sugar something, we've said it's an acid, and we spoke about the fact that it can be quite harsh, it can damage the inside of the blood vessels, especially if the concentration is too high. Can we live without carbohydrates? No, we cannot. I know that there are many diets and different kind of diets being advertised, and a low carb or a zero carb diet is spoken of. Your car is made of metal. It doesn't mean you put metal in the fuel tank. Just because your body is made structurally of protein doesn't mean you can live only on protein. We use carbohydrates as fuel, and fuel is necessary. Both oxygen and glucose are fuel sources. But is it a problem if that blood glucose level goes too high? It's a significant problem. So insulin is there to make sure that number one, the fuel actually gets into the cells, and number two, that sugar is not allowed to concentrate in the bloodstream because of the damaging effect that it does. So what does insulin do in response to once I've eaten? It basically will go and activate various different mechanisms to ensure that the sugar is used or stored. So if you remember nothing else that is on the slide, that's the two main things that you must know about for insulin. Is it either will help the sugar to be utilized immediately, either by the muscles or in the brain or wherever, or it'll store the excess because it's trying to work away from that sugar just floating around in the bloodstream and accumulating throughout the day. Is that a good thing? That's a good thing, right? But what happens if I'm eating excessive amounts of carbohydrates? What is it going to do? It's going to try and give enough to the muscles and the brain, the liver and everywhere to use what it can, but what will it do with the excess? It'll keep storing it. So what does it do? It actually works very hard at building fat cells with the excess. It produces extra, or it has a role to play with the production of extra fat cells, and it uses those fat cells as well as the liver to store excess sugar. Is that a good thing? Yes, it's protective for the blood vessels, but what if I keep adding excess and excess and excess? What am I going to end up with? I'm going to end up with obesity, and I'm going to end up with significant problems. So I'll show you two quick slides over here. Insulin, the way that it works is by, the detail again is not so important, but it's a hormone, it's a messenger, it attaches to little molecules on the outside of the cell. It's basically like the security guard that checks your ID and says, okay, you can go into the bank. Okay, so the insulin is there, it checks, oh, there's a glucose molecule, it double checks, is there space inside the cell? Yes, there's space in the cell, and then it will open the channel so that the glucose can go in. So in response to the insulin binding, That is basically where the checking process has activated, and then it allows the sugar to actually go into the cells. Is this evidence of an incredible creator? Amazing, right? Now, this is a very clever process because if the cell has already had enough sugar, it just says no thank you, no more, and those channels will stay closed, which means that sugar cannot enter the cell. And that, again, will activate the other processes. If there are so many cells that are saturated, they've had enough, what happens to the excess of the glucose? It'll go into storage. Where is it stored? In more fat cells. So do we see that this whole process is geared towards giving the cells what they need, first and foremost, and storing whatever's extra? Does that make sense? Now, insulin will activate this process of making fat cells and pushing glucose into storage mode, and it keeps doing that whenever the insulin levels are very high and whenever the glucose levels are very high. So here again, if I'm eating breakfast and eating a snack and lunch and snack again and I'm having dinner, what happens to the insulin levels? They keep spiking, which means there are constant messages going, keep storage, make more stored glucose, make more fat cells, make more fat cells. Do you see how those signals are repeated throughout the day? Interestingly though, on this graph it shows that the insulin levels drop at night time, but it doesn't actually drop at night time if I have eaten all day long and I'm having a big meal in the evenings, because then the insulin is necessary again for that nighttime meal. So then again through the night, the messages just keep coming, make more fat cells, make more fat cells. Do we see the problem there? In essence, what we end up with is a whole bunch of fat cells that are being made. But now here's the interesting thing, and I know that I'm giving you guys a lot of extra theory. Are you still somewhat with me? Or have I lost you 50%, 80% yet? We're still somewhat together.
Yes.
Have you heard of the term insulin resistance? There are various factors involved. This is not the only one, but I'm showing you one practical reason why you can have problems. Can you see how over here the glucose basically just goes through that space? We call it the intracellular space. The glucose goes through if the bank manager or the security guard says yes, go for it. If the door is open, the glucose just goes straight through. What about over here? There's a bit of a barrier here. Do you see that? The more fat we build up, the higher or the thicker the barrier is, which means that the insulin cannot actually communicate with the cells and the glucose cannot get into the cells. What ends up happening? You end up with excess glucose accumulating in the bloodstream. And what does it do? What is glucose in the bloodstream? It's an acid, it's abrasive. What happens if you have lots of glucose in a glass? If you've got sugar that you add to a glass of water and you just keep adding and adding, eventually it will crystallize, it won't dissolve, right? You can literally have crystallized sugar in the bloodstream that is abrasively scraping the inside of the blood vessels, creating micro wounds, apart from the acidic effect of it. Isn't that scary? So is this a good scenario to have? Not exactly. The other reasons for insulin resistance includes if you have so much sugar and so much insulin, and those insulin levels don't have times during the day where they drop down, it means that you've got so many signals. And what happens if that security guard, if people keep coming to say to him, can I come in, can I come in, please can I come in the bank, and he keeps saying, no, you can't come in, and he's like, please can I come in, eventually he's going to go, I can't hear you anymore. Isn't it? That's what ends up happening with this process, is that eventually those chemical signals are so overpowering that it basically blanks out, so that you end up with insulin resistance, and if that guy is not opening up the door, then you cannot get people going through the door, which means sugar cannot actually go where it's supposed to go. And in this scenario, the scary part is that the cells, are they getting their glucose that they need, if this is looking at that? Now the cells are being starved, so what are the signals that they keep giving to the brain? We're starving, please eat more. Do you see the problem? Do you see the vicious cycle that ends up with this whole thing? Okay, what is the basic bottom line of all of this? The basic bottom line is if I can sort out the digestion, if I can make sure that the food is fully digested in the stomach and that it moves through to the intestines when it is well digested, no fermentation, fresh condition, what happens? I'm getting fresh nutrients, right? I'm not producing toxins. Then my cells are actually getting what they want. Plus, if I'm spacing my meals, do you see how I'm not having these insulin spikes so frequently? I'm actually having just the insulin for the meal, but then it will have time to settle down. So I have far fewer ongoing nagging signals to keep making fat cells. Do we see that? If I'm not putting the washing machine on to work at night time and it rests and it relaxes, is it better effective tomorrow morning? Yes, it is. If it has had a night, if your stomach has been resting for the night with an empty stomach, those muscles are well rested, those glands that produce all the acids have rejuvenated, they have built up their supplies, which means that they can digest a solid, wholesome breakfast very well in the morning, and this whole process works a lot better. Right, yes.
That will also affect your sleep.
It drastically affects your sleep, and we have actually had this happen repeatedly where people mention that they've been insomniacs for so long, and yes, there are various factors that affect sleep, stress being one of them, and you can't always snap your fingers and make the stress go away. But if your body is busy doing processes that it's not meant to do at night, it does keep you awake. And remember that if you keep producing toxins, it keeps the liver out of its nighttime mode as well. So all of that affects, so it definitely has a very big impact on sleep. What do we want Healthy Harry to do in the end? We want Healthy Harry to recognize that his washing machine has to work in a certain way, finish the whole cycle, and then it works better. We want him to start deciding which way he's going to have his pie. Is he going to have the junk things, or is he going to look for healthier alternatives? And are there healthy alternatives to even the nice things? Can we make healthy desserts? Can we make healthy foods that are enjoyable and even act as treats? Absolutely. So Healthy Harry needs to make some decisions. He needs to look at his meal time and he needs to look at his day schedule to try and figure out how can I work out my day and my meal times in such a way that I respect this machine so that it can actually do what I want it to do. What is the end goal that we want to achieve with the stomach? I want to make sure that my nutrients can get into my bloodstream. And it cannot do that if I don't respect how it's going to be working. I also want to make sure that Healthy Harry knows that healthy means he's got to be active. Is the stomach more effective when it's got sluggish blood circulation and everything is all slow? Absolutely not. An active person will have a more active digestive system. It definitely helps things work a little bit better. The more sedentary lifestyle we have, the slower digestion will be, which means, how scary is that? A lot of the time, the very sedentary people tend to also eat more frequently. So the digestion is even slower, but they're adding things into the stomach a little bit more frequently, which is not ideal again. I'm going to share with you, for the last very short few slides, a couple of basic practical ways in which this translates. How can we make sure that not only the day routine is respected, but that the meal composition also allows for the stomach to do its work optimally? Plant-based foods always digest quicker. They produce fewer toxins and they are easier to digest. Despite the fact that animal products, especially meat, but including dairy, eggs, etc., despite the fact that the fiber content of those foods is absolutely zero, the plant foods, even with their high fiber, actually digests faster. So it means that the stomach can process a meal faster with less workload, and those nutrients are much more readily available for the body to use. The other thing to keep in mind is that when we are eating meat, we are taking second-hand nutrients. The cow has had all of the digestion processes. The cow's body took out a lot of the nutrients, used it in various different places, and when I'm eating the meat, I'm eating essentially the nutrients that it got from the plants, but I'm eating them secondhand. So if I'm eating the plants, I'm getting those nutrients firsthand, and chemically speaking, it's much easier for my body to actually utilize those nutrients. I want to eat plenty raw things. Raw foods contain enzymes that actually enhance the digestive processes. Does it mean I should never eat anything that is cooked? No, definitely not. Some nutrients actually are differently available in cooked versus raw, so I say to people, make sure that you get a variety. Your raw carrots have high nutrients in certain respects, and they have higher nutrients in the cooked form that are different. Like vitamin A, for instance, is more available in the cooked carrot than in the raw carrot. So use your variety, but make sure that your meals contain raw foods, especially your salads, because they increase digestibility. So having raw fruit with your breakfast and having raw vegetables with your lunch, for example, increases how well that digestive process happens. We want to have plenty of proteins, and a lot of people worry that plants don't have enough protein. Have you heard people say, where are you going to get your protein if you stop eating animal-based products? Where does the cow get his protein? From plants. Where does the gorilla get his protein? And the elephant. And the strong animals that we always talk about, they are plant-based because Plants are full of protein. And our amazing varieties that we get, thankfully we don't only have to eat grass. God has made us a variety, and we can get our proteins from legumes and nuts and seeds and various different things. Even whole grains have protein, so combining whole grains together give us complete protein profiles. It's incredible. So those are options. Do we need to do a little bit of extra planning? It's very easy to stop past McDonald's, right? But is that going to provide the right nutrients for my body? Is it going to add to toxicity? Yes, it is. So it might take a little bit of extra planning, but sometimes people say to me, yeah, but healthy foods always take much longer to prepare. Is there anything faster to prepare than a fruit? Fruit are the fast foods that God has made for us. So even when things get crazy and the days get crazy, fruit is an option to have a whole meal full of fruit, and that will give you ample nutrition. So it does take a bit of planning, but there are easy options as well. Proportions are important to keep in mind, and you will see here, this is an example. There's some cooked veggies, there are some raw veggies, there are some grains, and there are some legumes. We kind of work on average. We work on quarters, and if you have cooked fruit or veg, if you've got some raw, at least a quarter, and you've got whole grains, and you have some legumes, you will have a balanced meal if you organize it that way. It doesn't mean you have to have all those components with every meal. Not necessarily. Variety is okay, and it's fine to vary it a little bit, but that's kind of the basic idea for having a balanced meal. There are some extras that you'll see on that picture. We're not going to go in all of those details, but you can always increase the nutrient value of a meal, even by things like adding seeds, adding some herbs, etc. And then we want to make sure that we're getting variety, but, and here is the but, the last thing that I want to add to how the stomach works is keeping in mind that it's a chemical process as well as a mechanical process. So if I'm going to my church potluck and I'm seeing, okay, there are 55 ladies who made all their 55 different best dishes, and I'm having a little bit of every single one of those 55 dishes, what is my stomach doing with that mixture? It is struggling. Chemically speaking, it's struggling. There was one author that actually says that having so much variety at one meal creates a war in the stomach. And it really does do that. How many of us have experienced feeling that bloated, that typical after potluck bloating? It's a significant, it's a common occurrence after that meal. And it's because the stomach is really struggling with that. So should we vary our meals? Yes. Should we make sure that we get a variety of different grains, different legumes, etc.? For sure. But you don't have to put it all in one meal. Okay. We have a couple of resources on our website, and we've continued to build on these. They are, my husband calls them living documents. I think he's already annoyed with me because every now and then I keep saying to him, we need to update this other document. I've added this and I've added that and I've fixed this. But they are there and they're free to download, so you're more than welcome. I've just put 2 examples here. And one example is a document that talks about what we've spoken about tonight in a little bit more detail. If you want to share it with somebody that you think might find this helpful or practically relevant. We've also just recently started compiling a couple of recipes, and I promise you, I'm not a master chef, really, honestly. I'm just kind of making use of the recipes people share with us, and we're adding them. But having said that, I see that there's a recipe compilation at the back there, and that definitely has more in it. Mine only has 2 or 3 pages thus far. We'll add as we go, but there are recipes available at the back for those who want to have a look. And if you are interested in other resources, we have some on the website as well. We have this page that features in many of our resources, and we call it the Wellness Clock. I will enhance just a portion of this in a moment, but essentially, for me, this is how I would summarize to somebody what we have spoken about now. We have spoken about the blood circulation, the liver, the inflammatory processes, we've spoken about the digestive tract. And if I had to summarize to somebody the basic necessities for living a healthy lifestyle, this is how I would summarize it. Respect the New Start principles. Make sure that you recognize that we need both the oxygen and the sunshine and the food. It doesn't help me saying I'm going to eat a perfect diet and that's it. I need the other components as well. So New Start principles are important. But then we kind of summarize the health or the wellness clock, as I call it, making sure that we recognize that each meal needs to have its separate space. Trying to cut out snacks is a very, very practical, in fact, not such a difficult thing to do, and it has a huge impact on the health or the health of the body. Making sure that we are drinking before the meal and making sure that we leave a little bit of a gap after the meal where we are not drinking either. and allowing enough space for the stomach to do what it needs to do so that it can do its job properly. Trying to make sure that we go to sleep on an empty stomach, and you see the summary over here of the 5 to 6 hours with no snacking. Isn't super complicated what we've spoken about. I know we've given you a little bit of the extra theory so that you understand the reasons behind it, but when we look at these basic concepts of what are good general practices for health, is this very complicated? Are you going to experience your body giving you some temper tantrums when you start making changes? Yes, it will. It will complain. If you are used to eating in the evenings every night, for the first few nights that you decide to go to bed without having a full stomach, your brain is going to complain. But is it your stomach complaining? Is it your cells saying, oh, we don't have enough food? It's just the brain. The brain is just saying, I'm used to experiencing a meal at this time. What's happening? And how long does it take on average for that change to take place and for the brain to realize, oh, this is the new routine? They say 21 days. I promise you it never takes that long. If you're consistent, breaking an addiction, yes, and food can be an addiction, but some of these changes are very, very quick. We have generally heard patients saying if they stop eating that at night and if they stop having their snacks, they find that the cravings last approximately a week, and if they're consistent, then after a week the body adjusts to that new routine. So changing the routine is actually not that difficult to do. And especially if you're filling your meals with healthy things, if you're making sure that your meals are wholesome, that'll work. If I want to have a 5 to 6 hour gap between my meals, but I'm only having cornflakes for breakfast, and I'm having a little piece of toast for lunch, and then I want to not have a heavy meal at night time, is that going to work? It's not going to work. I've got to have nutritious, wholesome meals, right? But if I do feed my body with enough nutrition, then I can safely, 4 hours after I've eaten a meal and my stomach is shouting and saying I'm hungry, I can safely answer and say, you're not, you're okay. And I can leave it at that. So these are complicated, but they make a big impact, and we're in more for this final reminder that the Bible has given us this information again. Does the Bible tell us what the ideal diet is for our bodies? Right in the beginning, right in the start, in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we see all the New Start principles mentioned. The sunlight, the water is mentioned, the atmosphere is mentioned for fresh air, the day-night routine is mentioned, the routine of having rest periods in the evenings, the routine of a weekly rest is mentioned, and we even see that God says He put Adam and Eve in a garden to dress and to keep it, so their environment and their exercise is mentioned, and He clearly states, see, I have given you every tree, every green herb, every seed-bearing tree, this is for food. So He actually gives us the user manual, He summarizes it, He says, this is your washing machine, this is what you should put into it, this is how it works best. So He's answered those questions for us. But He also reminds us that we will not only live by the things that we put in our mouth, but we require every word from the mouth of God. And I want to leave that with you so that we also remember that everything that we've learned is not isolated from our Creator. It is given by our Creator to increase our trust and our faith in Him so that we can live by every word that comes from His mouth. He has spoken the world into existence. He has formed us with His personal hands. He loves us and cares for us, and we want to be connected to Him. Those New Start principles are not a man-made invention. They are God's plan for our health, and we can follow that with a clear conscience, knowing that we can trust in the Lord and lean not on our own understanding. Are we going to hear information from people around us that contradicts what we've just learned tonight? Absolutely. We are going to hear all manner of recommendations for when to eat, what kind of foods to eat. This diet is the best diet, that diet is the best diet. Where do we go for truth? When people's opinions conflict with each other, the Lord says you can always rely on me and you can go back to what I have already given you. It means we don't have to stress about trying to figure out whose science is the best science to follow or to trust or to follow. Do you think that this will give you options to share with somebody else again? Can we use this? I'm not saying that we can say this is the cure-all for everything, but you see how it can impact absolutely every part of the body. It impacts every organ. So hopefully this can also empower us to again share and be of service with others as we go forward.
I think the young man over there wants to ask a question.
Yes.
Right? Will you floor?
Ja.
Het Adam en Eva nie in die tuin net, so hulle het nog steeds geëet en dan het hulle gewag en dan weer geëet.
Dis 'n baie goeie vraag. That is a very, very good question. I actually have wondered about this frequently because I look at animals and I think, you know, the animals graze all day long, right? So why is it really such a problem for us to graze, to eat as we go? If I'm eating healthy things throughout the day, why is that an issue? And something came to mind because I've actually been praying about this and I keep saying to the Lord, Lord, for me this makes physiological sense, but I have this question about whether or not they actually respected that. I believe that the Lord taught them how to care for their bodies, so yes, information-wise, I think that they were given information about how to look after their bodies. But it also struck me at some stage that the Lord made sure that the Bible keeps the record of the fact that we are different to animals. He spoke everything else into existence. He spoke the animals and the planets and the atmosphere and everything into existence, but he got onto his hands and knees and he actually made us personally and he breathed into our nostrils the breath of life. He says that you are different. You are different, and he even told Adam and Eve that you will have dominion over the animals. In other words, he declared very clearly that they were not meant to think of themselves as animals. And I think if you also take into consideration that it takes self-control to think before you put something in your mouth, right? Do animals have self-control? Do they need self-control? Are they needing to resist against Satan's temptations? It's not relevant to them. But we need every possible opportunity to practice self-control that we can get. And I think God has given us that opportunity with what we put in our mouths by saying to us, I'm not asking you not to eat. I'm not asking you to starve yourself. I'm just asking you to just have a little bit of that thought in your mind of, do I really need this? Is this good for me? Should I eat it now? Do I need it now? And that actually gives us that opportunity from moment to moment, several times throughout the day often, to just exercise that self-control, which enhances our health and wellness in other ways as well. So, thankfully, we are not animals, and I believe that that's why the Lord also made us different. Any other questions? Yes?
Doctor, thank you very much. You have answered some of the questions that I was struggling with. In each and every health expo that we were required to attend, they told us to space meals by 5 hours, but the reason was not given. So I was struggling to know why, and like drinking before or after the meals, or even during the meals. Yes. And then you talked on the aspect of digestion. You said everything that gets in the mouth started the digestion process. So my question is this: what do we call it? The gum chewing gum. What does it have the effect in as far as the digestion goes? And then my second question is, the liver works at night, it has got a night shift. So what is the best position of sleeping in order to allow the liver to do its work at its optimal performance? Like sleeping maybe on your left or on your right, at your back, or just like that. Which position of sleeping is best?
Okay. So your first question was about the chewing gum, and that's an interesting thing because it was a very difficult one for me. I used to love chewing gum. I chewed chewing gum. I found a way to chew chewing gum in school, even though it was against the rules. I would make sure that I could hide it because I was very much addicted to chewing gum all the time. But the problem with chewing gum is twofold, actually. Number one, chewing gums are filled with toxins that you cannot even believe. Amongst other things, aspartame is an ingredient in almost every chewing gum, and aspartame is one of those food additives that should never be called food. It has been linked to autism and ADHD and cancers and all sorts of things like that. It's an artificial sweetener that causes lots and lots of problems. And if you actually check chewing gum, the ingredients, you will see that there are many words there that you can't even pronounce their names. It's all junk. It's really a lot of rubbish. And as you're chewing, you're absorbing little bits of that. Now, the chewing gum in and of itself is almost like plastic, But even that is not a good thing. So we are absorbing those negative things. And at the same time, if you are chewing ongoing for such a long time, you are constantly triggering messages going through to the stomach that basically keeps the stomach expecting something to come. So it will overproduce acids, and that can cause problems as well. If we're any organ that we demand higher from than what it's created to do, if we're overworking it, if we're asking it to do more than it's made to do, it's going to struggle. So chewing gum definitely has a problem in that sense. The second question that you were asking, yeah. Remind me again, the position of the sleep, you were asking for the liver specifically, right? For the liver, I don't know anything that a position can necessarily affect that. But what touched onto that was the fact that the position of sleep and sleep with the stomach has some effects. And even though for the liver, I'm not aware that one position is better than the other, for the stomach, it can cause problems, but that's why I'm laughing, because it can potentially open up a can of worms, because reflux is a very common thing. Any of you know somebody or experience acid reflux? It's a horrible thing to have. And both the position that we sleep in can have an impact on reflux, but most definitely what is happening in the stomach. We're checking if you're knowing and understanding what I've shared so far. If I'm going to bed with a stomach that is busy digesting, am I more likely to have acid pushing up? Far more likely. So one of the easiest ways to solve reflux problems is to have an empty stomach when you go to sleep. But the position of the sleep, the way that the stomach kind of bulges to one side, means that sleeping on your left side essentially allows for the food to pool in the stomach, whereas being on your right side allows the food to come closer to the opening that comes up into the throat. So for reflux, the left side is better than the right side. But in terms of the liver, I'm not aware of it causing any problems. And most of us actually turn from side to side in our sleep. So that's, I think, whichever is the comfortable position for your back, for your neck, for everything, that's also important. Any other questions? Reflux is we can spend a whole hour talking about reflux on its own, but I can say that everything we've spoken about tonight, when people put it into practice, a huge percentage of reflux issues actually go away. Any other questions about how the other night's informations relate or how things interact? One question back here.
So I have a friend that was James. So he actually asked me about tennis alpha and how to deal with it, and how it starts, and what you do with it very on. It says, just the pain now. It's very difficult, especially if you have heart disease. And he's quite a bit older. He's coming to 70.
Pain is a difficult one because there's always more than one factor that contributes to pain. So for instance with tennis elbow, that is a joint that has been overworked. It's not just inflamed because of what I've eaten, it's inflamed because of being overstressed and overworked. So there's a physical injury there that is in the process of healing. So I can't really say that, we can go into all that much detail about how to deal with the pain specifically for that. There are many things we can do, and we've spoken about hydrotherapy that is really effective for pain. But what we do know is that toxins increase pain sensitivity. It's always the case. So the higher my levels of toxins are in the body, the higher inflammation levels are, and the more frazzled and sensitive my nerves get. So one of the cardinal aspects of treating pain in all respects is to making sure that the toxin levels drop. And we do that by putting fewer toxins into the body and making sure that what I am putting in doesn't turn toxic because of the routine. So both of those things make a difference. Does that answer your question sufficiently?
Yeah, some additional information, especially things not actually solid. Acidity actually affects his joints as well, especially his elbows.
Yeah.
So that,
Yeah, like we spoke about for night number 2, joint problems in general, especially if it's ongoing joint problems, it can be an indication of toxicity. It certainly can be underlying gout. It can also be more than one thing. You can have a little bit of an element of gout and you can have an injury aspect on top of that. So it's often multifactorial. But you can never ever lose out by dropping down your toxins, eliminating toxins, and improving digestion. You can always only help the body in that way. Yeah. other questions? We've had, I can't actually believe it, it has been 4 nights. And I know that we've addressed a large quantity of information. We've covered quite a lot of information, especially tonight we spoke about insulin and all sorts of things. If you go home and you think of something afterwards that you think, oh, I wish I had asked this question, please feel free to bring those questions. I don't know how many of you are going to join us, but I hope that you will join us for our final session over the weekend. And we're going to kind of wrap everything up that we have spoken about in the session that we do on Saturday. So we hope that you will be here. Bring your questions if we haven't addressed them or if you think about them. And our details are also on the website, so if you need to get hold of us directly, you're welcome to do